Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to, just for the acknowledgement of time, just trying to allow a minute or two for other individuals to dial in. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, featured the Black Tax, the Cost of Being Black in America. My name is Andre Nottingham, and I serve as Assistant Director of Program Development and Advancement at Negro Cultural Center here at the University of Maryland. I'd like to take a quick moment to acknowledge my colleagues at Negro Cultural Center. They include Dr. Ronald Ziegler, who's the director, Ms. Ann Reese-Carswell, Associate Director, Mr. Solomon Kamajan, Assistant Director of Student Involvement and Public Relations, and Ms. India Ritchie, who's the Event Coordinator at Nimburu Cultural Center. Next up, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors. Without our co-sponsors, obviously we wouldn't be in a position to facilitate this webinar. So those being from the Judge Alexander Williams Jr. Center for Education, Justice, and Ethics, Judge Alexander Williams, I'd like to thank you very much. From the Nibiru Cultural Center, Dr. Ronald Ziegler. The Department of African American Studies, Dr. Joseph Richardson. Robert H. Smith School of Business, Dr. Victor Mullins, Associate Dean. And from the Department of Economics, Dr. Judy Hellerstein. The College of Behavioral and Social Science, Dr. Gregory Ball. And from the Office of the Vice President for Student Affairs, Dr. Patty Perillo, Vice President for Student Affairs, and also Dr. Warren Kelly, Senior Associate Vice President. So again, thank you very much. This has been a cross collaboration, throughout the campus for us coming together to facilitate this webinar. I would be remiss if I didn't mention, we were supposed to have Mr. Rochester with us last year, prior to the advent of COVID kicking in. So obviously we had to put that on pause. So we knew that this was such an important topic and an important issue that we wanted to address. So we wanted to make sure that even with COVID, in the midst of COVID, we figured, hey, okay, let's do this by webinar at this point, since that's where most of our operations are at this point in time. My partner that has been working with me on this since that 1 year time ago is Dr. Cameron Van Patterson. Dr. Patterson is the Director of Programs for the Judge Alexander Williams Jr. Center for Education, Justice, Ethics, and he's also Assistant Research Professor in the Department of African American Studies here at the University of Maryland, College Park. And in these complementary roles, Dr. Patterson works to design, develop, and promote and lead the implementation of strategic initiatives and programs that improve the outcomes and creating more robust structures or opportunity for people. So without further ado, I'd like to, at this point, have Dr. Van Patterson come on, introduce himself, and he has a few words he'd like to share.
Thank you so much, Andre. Thank you for your leadership and for your dedication in helping this important conversation move forward despite the challenges you alluded to in your comments. I want to welcome everyone here today, and I want to thank you first and foremost for making time out of your busy schedules. I know many of us are constantly moving from one virtual event to another in this environment. And so we don't take for granted your time. And so we're going to try and respect your time and keep to our program. This is obviously a very, very profound and important subject, especially given what Dr. King called the fierce urgency of now. We all are aware of the myriad crises confronting the US and the world globally. And I think that the racial wealth gap is one of the most urgent and important issues of our time. As our keynote speaker today, Shawn Rochester, has said, we have spent far too much time focusing almost exclusively on civil and social issues. It's time to focus on economic advancement. Many of the challenges that we face in the country today, particularly as it pertains to racial justice and equity, really stem from the history of economic exploitation and inequality. And we've seen those gaps swell in recent years. Many reports and authors and scholars will tell you that the disparities in our country particularly in the social economic spaces, the social determinants of health, have all grown, and we've seen how the pandemic has only exacerbated those disparities, exposing in many of the challenges and inequalities that were already there. And so part of the impetus for this conversation really is, it comes from our focus on equity and really what it means to have an equity lens in our approach to discussing these issues. We're really excited to have Shawn here, and I just want to, before I pass our time back to, or yield my time back to Andre, I want to just note what Dr. Julianne Melvaux said during her testimony in 2019, June of 2019, on Juneteenth, actually, before Congress on HR 40, which many of you know is the bill. Currently, it's been in Congress for years, for decades, concerning reparations. And she said the economic damage to Black people post-Reconstruction can be summarized in three ways. One, African-American people were denied the right to participate in our nation's economic growth. Two, African-American people were denied the right to accumulate wealth intergenerationally. And three, African-American people were subjected to public policy hostility, which provided rights for whites that were unavailable to African-Americans. And so the issue, when we talk about the cost of being Black in America, when we talk about reparations, when we talk about the racial wealth gap, we're talking about something that is systemic, that is both historical and present, something that is structural. We're talking about structural violence. We're talking about anti-Black structural racism, right? And these are the terms, this is the language, this is the discourse that I think we have to really confront in order to actually solve these problems, so that generations from now, our children are having these same conversations. I'm a father, and so for me, this is about the future. This is about creating a more inclusive, democratic society in which we can all thrive. And so I thank you for participating. I want to invite you and encourage you to post questions in the chat and Q&A, because we're going to try and make sure that we build in some time once Shawn has finished his presentation to really do a deep dive and answer some of the questions that you may have concerning this topic. So again, welcome. This is being recorded, and we will post this webinar online in several places, and we'll be sure to let everyone who registered know where they can watch this and share it with others, because this is a conversation that is beginning, well, that is continuing today, but it certainly is ongoing, and we hope that you'll continue to be part of it. Thank you so much, and welcome to the Black Tax.
Great job, Dr. Van Patterson. Appreciate you for that. As far as about our featured presenter today, I mean, I could go on and on talking about Mr. Rochester, but just to kind of give you a little bit of his bio, real quick, concise, to the point. Shawn D. Rochester is the CEO of the Good Steward LLC and the founder of the PhD Enterprises and the Idea Institute. These organizations, they provide financial education and advisory service to consumers. They increase the presence of Black employees and enterprises in the U.S. public and private sector, payroll, supply chains, facilitate commerce between Black business community across the African diaspora and the African continent. So Mr. Rochester is a highly sought after speaker. He's spoken in very numerous venues. So just some of those, including Wall Street, Silicon Valley, leading universities, and also United Nations, in which he's presented. Mr. Rochester's academic background, he holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Rochester and a Master's in Business Administration from the University of Chicago, the Booth School of Business, with a focus in accounting, finance, and entrepreneurship. He's also the author of The Black Tax, which we feature today, The Cost of Being Black in America, and CPR for the Soul, How to Give Yourself a 20% Raise, Eliminate Your Debt, and Leave an Inheritance for Your Children's Children. I could go on, and I could, share the accolades and otherwise. Just wanted to share real quick some of the companies and other institutions in which Mr. Rochester spoke, and he's spoken at Google, Amazon, JP Morgan Chase Company, UPS, Oracle, Microsoft, the United Nations, Alliance Bernstein, Cornell University, Merck, Viacom, Hampton University, University of Rochester, on and on and on. So we can go on for days with that. Also, Mr. Rochester has hosted several TED Talks. So obviously you can Google him, and I'm sure many of you have already done so, to engage or see the engagement of his dynamic conversations and discussions. I've heard a lot of the concepts before that Mr. Rochester talks about, but I had never succinctly had those figures quantified and articulated to the extent that Mr. Rochester has done. So, I've had the opportunity between myself and Dr. Van Patterson to have some great conversations with him. I won't, go on and on with it, but at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Rochester to really get into the crux of what he's here to talk to us about today with the Black tax. So without further ado, Mr. Rochester, welcome.
Andre, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone who is spending some time with us this afternoon to really talk about a vitally important topic. So if you guys bear with me, I am going to share my screen and pull up some charts that we will walk through. All right, so hopefully you can see this in full screen view. Again, as was said, my name is Shawn Rochester, and I'm the author of a book called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And in that book, I quantified the financial cost of discrimination against Black people, past and present. Normally, when we talk about discrimination, we tend to look at it from the perspective of the immorality or the injustice. I wanted to look at it differently. I wanted to take a look at what is the financial cost of discrimination, and more importantly, what does research from some of the finest institutions in the country say that cost is. So the book is broken into 3 parts. In the first part, I talk about the Black tax, or the economic cost of discrimination in the present context, and markets and areas that are really critical to wealth accumulation for Black people. So it's the housing, it's the automotive, it's the insurance, and the financing that underpin it. It is online commerce and the job search, as well as high-end careers, as capital raising for business, so on and so forth. In the second part of the book, I do a look back from the time of slavery and kind of walk through to the present and just look at really discriminatory practices that we may or may not be aware of from the perspective of what is the economic cost of that at the end of the day. In the third part of the book, I kind of do a summary of where are we from an economic perspective. I introduce a framework, an economic framework that's called PhD. And it stands for Purchase, Hire, and Deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand business, and provide capital in the Black community. Why is that of particular importance? It's critically important because pre-COVID, we were missing about 6 million jobs across the broader Black community. And while you may be aware that there's about 2.6 roughly million Black businesses, what a lot of people are not familiar with is only about 4% of those generate any revenue. Actually 4% generates about 70% of the revenue, about $100 billion, and employs about 1 million people. And we are missing 1.4 million of those businesses. If you look at the data, there's roughly 109 or 110,000 of those businesses that actually are large enough to have employees. We're missing about 1.4 million of those. That's obviously massive. And then of course you have the wealth gap itself, which people talk about, but I like to really kind of quantify. And the wealth gap is about $841,000 between the average Black and white family. And if you multiply that across roughly 17 million Black families, that's about $14 trillion, right? So these are really kind of massive numbers, as you can imagine, right? Now, one of the things that we need to do to solve problems of this size, as you can imagine, is get a lot of people at the table, right? Much like we have now. But it's really challenging, even if you do have a lot of people at the table to work on problems, if A, they don't see the problem, or B, they think you're the problem, right? If you would just fix you, then we would be great. And I want to share a couple of platitudes with you that you may have heard, right, in your walk. First is really the matter is that Black people are simply not trying hard enough. And that has more to do with not getting ahead than any type of racial discrimination. You've got over 6 in 10 Americans believe that. Or you might have heard that Black people have the same or even better chance, actually, at getting ahead in America. About, over 6 in 10 Americans believe that. Or you may have heard that racism, quite frankly, is an excuse for failure. The issue is, instead of me owning up to my own failure, I spent all my time kind of pointing the finger at other people and blaming other folks, right? Black people are not the only ones who've been discriminated against. They're not the only ones that have very difficult times, so on and so forth. But yet, other groups have gone on to progress and accumulate wealth. You've got over 7 in 10, Americans that believe that. The challenge here is if this is the background thinking and resonance, that this level of thinking is going to show up in the policies, plans, and programs that people are going to put in place to actually solve these challenges. Now, something that's really important for us all to know and understand is that, effective problem solving is based on a foundation of empathy and understanding. With empathy being our ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, really to understand things from their perspective, and also to understand the pathology, like how did they get there? How did they arrive at that situation in the first place? And understanding, of course, is just how we use data and information to make the world a better place for ourselves, right? And for our fellow man, right? And woman. So I want to share a quote with you from Albert Einstein that he gave in an address to the National Urban League back in 1946. And what Mr. Einstein said was, we must make every effort to ensure that the past injustice, violence, and economic discrimination, which by definition is the Black tax, will be made known to the people. The taboo, let's not talk about it, must be broken. So heeding the advice of Mr. Einstein, let's talk about it, right? So in the time that we have together this afternoon, what I want to do is talk a little bit about how is it that after over 400 years, more than 45 million Black people only own about 2% of US wealth. Either we are consistently and colossally inept, or there is something else going on in the background that we need to take a closer look at, right? So that's what I want to do, right? Let's take a closer look. So what we're going to do is go back to the time of slavery, and we're going to walk through, right, as much as we can into the modern context. Now, one of the important things I think it's that we all need to understand is that slavery, by definition, is a 100% tax on your labor. Quite frankly, nothing that you produce is yours. Not even you are yours, right? Now, I'm not going to talk about all of the horrors associated with this institution, but I do want to look at things from an economic perspective. And one of the things that we need to understand is there's plenty of things that we couldn't put a value on, right? You couldn't put a value on what it is to be a man and to be unable to protect your loved ones, or what it is to be a woman and to be unable to have control of your body for the entirety of your life, or to be able to enjoy the fruits of your labor, so on and so forth. But there are things that we can value. And economists have looked at what is the economic cost of labor extracted from millions of people over almost a 250-year period, roughly a quarter of a millennia, right? And some put that number as high as 24 trillion. Others put it as high as 97 trillion. If you assume that the truth is somewhere in the middle, we could be talking about as high as $50 trillion extracted from millions of people over almost a quarter of a millennia. It's a large number. We might be unfamiliar with that, but that's not the only number that we can look at. If we go to 1860, right, and what we know is that we have about 4 million people held in bondage, right? Those 4 million people are the most liquid asset in the country. They are 50% of the full economic value of the South. And they're traded on open markets. There's a price if you're old or young, able-bodied or lame, or male or female. So you can put a value on what those folks were. It turns out that the value of those people is so large, you have to look at it in terms of national income or wealth, right? So from a wealth perspective, it's between 16 and 20% of US wealth. If you look at it from an income perspective of GDP, it's 1 to 2 years of GDP. That's where the economists place it. So from a wealth perspective, it's about 15.5 trillion. Where's that number come from? So at the time I did the research and wrote the book, national wealth was about 85 trillion. 16 to 20% of that is 14 to 17 trillion. If you take an average of those two, you're at 15.5, right? You look at it from an income perspective, it's roughly 28.5 trillion. Where'd that number come from? So if you look at GDP pre-COVID, it was about $19 trillion. 1 to 2 years of that is 19 to 38 trillion. You take an average of those two, you're at 28.5. Two different modes, right, to come up with the valuation of those people. Take an average of that, it puts you at roughly $22 trillion. Enormous number. But that's not the only estimates we can look at. We can actually go back to 1839, and we can see that Henry Clay is laying out the economic value of people held in bondage at that time on the floor of Congress. He places that number at $1.2 billion. Now, if we look at the work of Thomas Piketty, he says that returns on slave-related investments yielded typically 6 to 8% per annum. So if we use the number that's slightly outside and lower from that term, about 5.5%, and we bring that forward into the present context, it's over $24 trillion. Now, if you say, who is this Henry Clay guy? Why should we listen to him? We can go back even further into the 1810s, and we can look at the estimates that are coming from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, founding fathers, right? And they placed the value of people held in bondage at that time at roughly 1 year of national GDP or income. So that's the equivalent of about $19 trillion in today's context, or the equivalent of selling 1/3 of all publicly available lands, right, at that time. So the point here is when we talk about the value of resources extracted from Black people during that period, and we talk about the value placed on those individuals themselves as a group in today's equivalent, we're talking about gargantuan numbers, right, that are really kind of hard to quantify, right? So when you talk about slavery, it's as high as 15 trillion. Let's discuss a little bit about the economic implication of what we just kind of talked about. So if you look in a present context and you ask yourself, what's the net worth of Black people today in America? It's about $1.5 trillion. Now, we just established that it's roughly $22 trillion in today's equivalent for 4 million people kind of held in bondage, which implies that 4 million people held in bondage over 150 years ago had an economic value that was 15 times more than the net worth of 45 million people, Black people today, right? Which is an extraordinary thing. So, you might say, look, I get it. These are some really gargantuan numbers. I hadn't thought about that before. But as you said, this was 150 plus years ago. There's been a lot of time between then and now to accumulate wealth. By the way, a lot of folks have come here between that then and now, and they've accumulated significant amounts of wealth, right? What's the issue when it comes to Black people in particular? And I'm like, I hear what you're saying, but we got to keep things in context, right? We know that there was no economic distribution, right? There was no startup capital provided to those people. We're all familiar with 40 acres and a mule. And we may be familiar with the Homestead Act. Remember that from kind of middle school or junior high school. What I always thought would be interesting is to look at what would be the economic value of those two amounts in today's equivalent and be able to kind of compare and contrast that, right? So when you talk about 40 acres and a mule, if something like that had been distributed to those people held in bondage, that would be about 160 million acres. It's a massive number. Now, I once looked at purchasing 400 acres with a group of friends. And for 400 acres, you got to go up in a helicopter to see that, right? 160 million acres is really hard to comprehend. Now, if we look at the price of an acre, which is roughly $3,020 to $6,350, and we did some quick math, that would put that at about $1 trillion on the high end, right? Generating about $90 billion a year. Now, you got to remember, these are farm acres I'm talking about in terms of these pricing. These are not Manhattan, Bay Area, Miami, Austin, Chicago type property, right? This is farmland. Now, And so we see the economic impact of that. And $1 trillion can sound like an enormous number because it is, but it's only about 2% of the 50 trillion that was extracted. So not even that was allowed as a startup capital. But if you look at the Homestead Act, right, what we see is, 246 million acres were distributed to 1.5 million white families. Homestead Act was passed in 1862, and over the next 60 years, right, 246 million acres will be distributed to roughly about 1.56 million, 1.5 million white families. So if you do the same math on farm, acreage, it's about 1.6 trillion on the high end, or a little more than $1 million a family. Now, I'm all about hard work and bootstrapping. $1 million is a hell of a bootstrap, right? So how did this thing work? You had the opportunity to claim about 160 acres. And if you were so fortunate to be able to do so, and if you stayed on that land for 5 years, at the end of that period, you could take possession of that land, right? For little to no consideration whatsoever. Now, if you were an immigrant coming from Europe at that time, and you were able to stake one of these claims and stayed on that land for 5 years, at the end of 5 years, not only would you take possession of the land, but you could also naturalize and become a citizen, because that's about how long it took to naturalize back in those days, right? So researchers say, if you think about the direct beneficiaries associated with this massive, giveaway, it's up to 93 million white Americans, direct, right? It's not tertiary, secondary related in some kind of way. So which is kind of an enormous start to be capitalized. If you so you got $1 trillion of land not distributed, and then 1.6 trillion that was distributed to folks. If you kind of fast forward, you've got the Civil War, which has occurred, right? Clearly the Southern economy is devastated, right? The global cotton market is devastated. The land confiscated, right, in the Civil War, because all of it was confiscated, is given back to the white planter class. And there is a need, right, a massive need for cheap, abundant, available labor. Now, let me just kind of double back and kind of talk about a few things here, right? So when we talk about the global cotton market is devastated, we have to understand that cotton at that time was like the equivalent of oil. It's the first truly global industry. There's 20 million people employed in this around the world. 1 million of those people lose their jobs because of the Civil War. The US dominates 80% of that global market on raw cotton. You cannot beat free labor. And raw cotton exports is 61% of total US exports, right? So massively important, and it creates what's known as this global cotton famine. It affects everywhere. It affects India, it affects Egypt, it affects Europe, of course, Japan, the whole industrialized world. So the world is crying out, what is America going to do to put her newly free people back to work, right? And the answer to that is this construct called Jim Crow, an amazingly nondescript name. But what is it fundamentally? It is a system of laws and customs that is reinforced with an extraordinary level of violence that's designed to reimpose a 100% tax on the sharecroppers' labor. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? Clearly, these people were poor and impoverished, but a 100% tax, which means that they had nothing, sounds hyperbolic, right? And I hear you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you determine whether or not it was 100% tax, right? So let's talk about it a little bit. So what is sharecropping and how did it work, fundamentally? So because this Jim Crow system is underpinned by this kind of sharecropping construct. So one of the first things that it's, we need to understand is like those large mega plantations were broken into smaller lots. Black families would agree to, settle on those lots and plant cash crops and bring those crops eventually to market, right? And in exchange for doing that, they would share in a portion of the crop once it was taken to market, literally where the name comes from. What's important to understand is that, this is fundamentally a labor contract, right? There's an actual contract. All the terms and conditions are set by the white landowner, right? The other thing, and some of those terms and conditions state that if you fell ill and you're unable to, bring the crop to market, to cultivate it, they can outsource it to somebody else and charge it back to you. The other thing that's important to understand is that the harvest doesn't come tomorrow, right? The harvest comes at the end of the year or at the end of the season, right? And between now and then, these people who have very little to no economic resources, they need to get food, clothes, shelter, tools, fertilizer, everything to bring the crop to market from this, white landowner. So they're being lent the resources on credit to be able to do that at rates as high as 70% per year. So extortionary, interest rates associated with it. So fundamentally, that white landowner sets your cost structure. Now, when you do bring the crops to market after the harvest, the white landowner is the market. He tells you what the crop is worth, which means that he controls your revenue and your income. Now, if somebody controls your revenue and somebody controls your income, by definition, they control your profit. And I think you know where I'm going with this 100% tax. So if you are fortunate, your profit will net to zero, right? Because they may not want you. And if they don't want you to go somebody else more generous, what they will do is they will make your profit negative, which is you owe them. And they will roll that over into the future. And now you're in perpetual debt servitude. Now, I know what you are thinking here, because it's the same thing that I'm thinking, which is that's a horrible deal, right? And I would never take that deal. Like, you can forget about that. And if you don't take that deal, they got a law for that. Those are called vagrancy laws. And those laws state that if you cannot prove that you are a landowner or that you are gainfully employed, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. Now, if you say, all right, I didn't see that one coming, but I'll sign the contract. But you know what? Upon second thought, I'm not going to do it. It's a horrible deal. If you do that, they got a law for that. Those are called contract enforcement laws, which means you broke that labor contract. And they could charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. Now, you might say, look, fine, put me in jail. I'm not doing the work anyway, right? And when you get ready, you could just let me out. If you take that deal, they have something for that. And it's called convict leasing, which means that they can lease you back out to the very same white farmer that you did not want to work for, or to a private corporation. And here's what I need you to understand about convict leasing, right? That there is one respect in which you could argue, but just in this respect, it's even worse than slavery. And because while a slave owner will kill you or beat you within an inch of your life, slaves are expensive. And they would much rather have you around for another 5, 10, 15 years to maximize the return on their investment. They have what's known as an interest in your residual value, right? Your value beyond today. Under convict leasing, they have no such interest. They do not care about your health and well-being in the future. They only care about how much work they can extract from you under the contracted term, 6 months, 8 months, 18 months. That's it. So under these conditions, you've got mortality rates approaching 50%. That's a 1 in 2 chance of death, right? And while that is draconian, it's also extremely lucrative and profitable because you're just buying a portion of someone's time, not the fullness of their time. And it's so profitable that in 1914, about 20% of the state of Alabama's revenues are coming from convict leasing alone. And there are estimates that that number is significantly higher than that, right? So I think let's talk a little bit about what kind of legal framework would have to be in place to allow something like that to happen to literally millions of people, right? So if you look at what Professor Roback, who's an economics professor at Yale University, says, she says that these Jim Crow laws may be understood as enforcing or trying to enforce an otherwise unenforceable labor market cartel, right? So there's only so much that discrimination itself will do. Somebody will try to profit maximize. Somebody will try to offer a lower deal. So you put laws in place to limit the ability of that to happen, right? So if you go to 1883, there's a Supreme Court decision that strikes down the original civil rights, legislation from 1875, right? And effectively, what they are saying is the government has no right to prevent, private individuals or private businesses from discriminating against Black people. Here's what I want you to understand. We are obviously under a capitalist society, which means that the means and mode of production is in the hands of the private individual or the private, corporation. And what this is saying is that those individuals have the ability to discriminate against Black people to the extent that they largely see fit, right? And then we also, if you fast forward to 1896, you obviously have the Supreme Court decision that establishes the separate but equal, right? Which is fundamentally saying that if you can keep the facilities equal, that you can discriminate in the public sector. And we, of course, know that those facilities were not kept equal. We'll talk about some of that in the future. So what we have here is really an unfettered ability to discriminate at all levels. Why is this important, right? Oh, let's talk a little bit about how some states react to this. So you've got constitutional conventions, right, that are held in Mississippi. You can see their stated purpose, the policy of crushing out the manhood of Negro citizens, amazingly explicit. You can look at Louisiana's constitutional convention stated purpose, established the supremacy of the white race. Promptly registered Black voters drops by 99% over the next 8 or so years. In Virginia, you can see again, to discriminate to the very limit of permissible action. So this is unfettered levels of discrimination. And Gary Becker, who's a Nobel Prize winner, and who wrote a book called The Economics of Discrimination, says that, if effective discrimination occurs against Negroes at all levels, clearly established that it occurs at all levels, then the relative and absolute difference in absolute income of Blacks will continue to fall as discrimination increases, right? So when you think about this, you say, look, maybe this was a short period of time, right? All nations and peoples kind of go through like a short time, but we get past it, we get through it. This thing wasn't a bad 3 or 5 year period. It lasted for roughly 75 years, right? To 1870 into the mid 40s or beyond, and over about 4,000 Black people that we've documented, right? There's more, were executed, lynched during this period of time by their fellow citizens. It's the equivalent of one Black person being executed per week for 75 years. Nobody's been charged with these crimes. Nobody's been held accountable. Your family will get the hint. Your church will get the hint. Your community will get the hint. There's no one coming to save you, right? So I think you see the environment where you can impose 100% tax on a sharecropper's labor. Now, which means by definition is slavery, right? If it's 100% tax. And that's why they call this period slavery by another name, right? Now, if during the period of legal slavery, up to 50 trillion was extracted, and you still have this period, which is slavery by definition, that lasts another 75 years or a third longer, you can argue that during that period of time, another 15 trillion was extracted from those people and their descendants. So if we think about the implication of this, right, upon emancipation and the Civil War, the white power structure in the South loses about $22 trillion of economic value. But over the next 75 years or so, they would claw back another 15 trillion through this construct from those people and their descendants, right? Now, you might say, listen, that's true, but truth be told, not everybody was under the Jim Crow regime. Some people actually did get education. Education is a great equalizer, right? W.E.B. Du Bois was educated at Harvard during that period of time. And that is true, right? But it was also a different time, and we have to look at things in context. Yes, there was the push for the expansion of public education. Clearly, newly free people wanted that for themselves and for their children, as they should. Small white farmers wanted that for their children, as they should. Clearly, the white planter class was not interested in that, A, because they educated their children in private institutions, and B, they wanted cheap, readily available labor, right? But they needed the help of the smaller white farmer. So they agreed to the expansion of public education, but rerouting resources from Black students to white students. Now, Du Bois says that in the 40 years since emancipation, Negro taxes and the Negro share of income from indirect taxes and endowments has fully repaid the investment that whites have made in the education of Black people. It's just a statement about how little was invested in educating, Black people. If you look at Thomas Logan, who is an industrialist and a former Confederate general, he articulates the position, which is when the freedman regards himself qualified to earn a support by mental work using your intellectual capabilities, he's unwilling to accept, manual labor. Why is this important, right? If you go to 1914 and you look at the words of William H. Baldwin, who's the president of the General Education Board, and you can think of that as like the Department of Education before the Department of Education. He says that the South needed Negroes educated so that they could be the best possible laborers, right? With the right kind of education, Negroes will willingly work menial jobs, and that will open up opportunities for Southern whites to work the more expert labor, right? So the focus is on menial, unskilled labor for Black people. So little is invested that by 1917, it's only about 64 public high schools for Black students across the South. Again, it's not in a region, it's not in a district, it's not in a state. This is across, the South. And most of those are actually built and owned by Black people, right? They're appendages to churches and church infrastructures by and large. If you go to 1920 and you look at New York City public school system, they are investing 50 times more, 50 times more per child in that school system than South Carolina is investing in its Black students under their segregated system, right? So if you were, from Europe, you came to the New World with nothing but the shirt on your back, and you settled in this area of New York City under the school system, 50 times more will be invested in your children's human capital development than the children of Black people who had been here for generations, right? And at this time, New York City clearly was not as diverse as we know it to be now. It was 97.1% white at that time. If you look in the South, for every dollar that's invested in a white child, $5 to $8 are invested. For every dollar that's invested in a Black child, $5 to $8 are invested in a white student. No rocket science there. If you do that with your children, one is going to be impoverished, the other one's going to go to Harvard, right? And in the South, Black teachers teaching the same curriculum and material are making 25 to 34 cents on the dollar for the exact same work. Very difficult to accumulate wealth under these circumstances, right? And if you look at by the age of 25, white students are receiving 50% more years of education. Just massive difference, right, in the investment of human capital between Black children and white children. So Gary Becker, again, says that if you look in that first half of the 20th century, that Negroes have advanced little in relative occupational hierarchy. Very little difference change between Black and white. New factory, more opportunities for janitors to be there, not managers and other more meaningful work. And researchers say, listen, if you kept the discrimination the same in other places, but you just invested in the children equally, that alone could have cut the earnings gap by up to 50%. So when you start to think about the impact of that over a generation of millions of children, and today's equivalent, you're talking about over $600 billion of impact. When you start talking about that over multiple generations, right, and millions of children for roughly a 90-year period, you're talking about over $3 trillion of opportunity costs, right, associated with that. So education, substantial. Now you can make the argument, you know what? Back in those days, education was not critical to success per se, right? If you had a terrific work ethic, then you could accomplish a lot in life. Many people have stories of, grandfathers and great grandfathers who had a third year or fifth grade education, terrific work ethic, worked extraordinarily hard, accumulated resources, built a home, did a terrific job, right? For their families. And home ownership is actually really critical. It's the great wealth builder, right? And the country believes in it deeply, right? Home ownership underpins the American dream. and the government has invested accordingly, right? Roughly $120 billion at that time, the equivalent of, $1 trillion today. Extraordinary, which is a great thing. And it created what we know of the middle class today, right? Like a construct that really did not exist prior to that, anywhere. Now, the unfortunate aspect of this is by design, less than 2% of those resources actually went to Black Americans, while more than 20 million Europeans who came during that period of time after they naturalized had access to these, significant resources. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with redlining. I won't go into the details on that, but it's just safe to say that the US government created the mortgage as we know it by guaranteeing or underwriting mortgage payments from US citizens that allow banks to take lower down payments, to have longer repayment periods. That's where the 30-year repay comes from. And also to have, reasonable interest rates associated with it. They did not do that for Black citizens, and certainly not for Black citizens who were interested in moving into more and better resource white communities. Financial institutions followed suit. If you went directly to the developer, they followed suit as well. Real estate agents would not participate in transactions if you wanted to buy a home in a better resource white community. And even the residents amongst themselves signed agreements called covenants, where they guaranteed that or promised that when they sold their property, it would only sell to a person who's Caucasian or European descent. So you've got a complete wall, right? That's kind of preventing you from participating, in the greatest wealth building structure that really the world has ever seen, right? Appreciation of US real estate. Now, we can be more concrete and say that between 1930 and 1960, less than 1% of all mortgages in the nation went to Black people, right? That's an incredibly strong statement, right? You're unable to effectively participate, right, in this wealth creation. Now, just because you can't get this kind of mortgage doesn't mean that you don't, want to be a homeowner. Of course you want to be a homeowner. So what did people do? They turned to the private markets under this thing called contract sales. And in a private market, there is no requirement for an appraisal. So prices of homes are going at 2x the market rate. You have extreme interest rates associated with it. And probably the most draconian measure of all is that as you make your installment payments, you don't earn any equity in the home as you do it. So you can think of that as if we agreed that I would take possession of the home after making 100 installment payments. I made 100 of those. I made 99 of those on time. I missed the 100th for whatever reason. You get to keep my 99 payments. You get to keep my down payment, take back the house, evict me, resell it to someone else. And I've accumulated no equity in that home. And oh, by the way, while I was in it, I was responsible for 100% of the payments. A horrible construct. Now, if you go to, the estimates are that if you think in that greater Chicagoland area, which was a huge area for the migration of Black people out of the South, if you look at that within the 1950s, the estimates that are that 85% of all real estate transactions that took place in that area for Black people happened under this contract sales construct. Again, incredibly difficult to accumulate wealth, under this situation. Now you can say, well, all right, well, just kind of hunker down where you are, and things will pass. Eventually, save as much money as you can. Problem is, even in these kind of urban centers, right, these so-called ghettos, and the rents there are like 50% more than the rents outside of it. Sounds counterintuitive. Doesn't seem to make any sense. These are less desirable areas. But the challenge is you've got millions of people fleeing the South, and they're unable to move into better resourced, white communities. So Black people are being corralled in these kind of urban city centers. And what happens when the demand for housing increases faster than the availability of housing? You see an increase in prices, right? Particularly in terms of rent. Very difficult to accumulate wealth. 1968, the Federal Trade Commission did a study, and they found that goods and services inside of these communities cost 3 times more than outside of it. 3 times more, right? Again, very difficult to accumulate wealth under these circumstances. If you say just hunker down and work hard, right? There's been research done on labor market discrimination from the late 20s into the early mid-60s. And what they've identified is about $1.6 trillion of discrimination over that period of time that Black people faced. That's at $83. If you brought that forward to the present context, it'd be over $4 trillion, just massive. So work done by the University of Bern and New York City, Fed indicate they did an analysis from World War II up into the present, that 70-year period. And they said they saw no progress being made in terms of reducing the income and wealth gap inequalities between Black and white households over that period of time. This gives you context as to why it would have been so difficult to actually reduce those gaps, over time. So when you think about housing, talking about a gigantic amount, as well as the effect on labor. Now, there's also the New Deal. We won't have the opportunity to kind of walk through that right now. And the GI Bill was, of course, the expenditures spent on interstate highway system, both of which are massive. Then, of course, you've got, from the end of the civil rights era up until the present, right? The cost of economic discrimination there. We won't have time to go through all of these things, right now, but I cover all this stuff in the book. So feel free to check that out. You'll really like it. So kind of where are we now, right? So where we're now, what we're dealing with is right now we're missing about $1.2 trillion of income across the broader Black community. $1 trillion of that is associated with the missing business infrastructure, right? That's in place. $500 billion is associated with consumer income, unemployment, underemployment, so on and so forth across millions of people. Of course, we talked about the wealth gap, 841,000 between Black and white families on average, times 17 million, roughly, Black families, it's $14 trillion. It's a massive number, right? And of course, the gap in jobs and businesses currently, right, and proportionally in the Black community. Now, I'll talk a little bit about something that kept coming up when I was doing research for this, which is this thing called the 2% rule, which I kept seeing this number showing up again and again and again, right, in the research. And it seemed like areas that were really critical for wealth accumulation in general and for Black people in particular, we tend to participate around 2% or so. So if you look at, corporate supply chain spend, it's less than 2% is spent on Black enterprise. Again, I'm not talking about diverse spending, I'm talking about Black enterprise. If you look at government supply chain spend at all levels, federal, state, local, it's typically less than 2%, right? If you look at how much, Black people spend on their own businesses, of the total aggregated income, which is somewhere around 1.2 trillion, less than 2% of that is spent, on Black enterprise. If you look at high growth, high earning careers, almost all of them, you have like a Black participation rate around, 2%. If you look at SBA lending, less than 2%, it's 1.6%. And if you look at venture capital and friends and family and angel rounds, so on and so forth, capital is really critical to business formation. Again, it's less than 2%, right? Significantly so. All of this obviously has a negative, depressive impact on, business formation, business expansion, right? And jobs in the Black community. Now, one of the things I want to do is, share something with you. When I gave my first talk at Google, I got a great question that was asked. They were like, we see more clearly like the impact on Black people of this kind of discriminatory behavior, but could you talk a little bit also about what has been the impact on the country? And I thought that was a great question. It was profound. And I didn't have the answer at the time. And I said I would take a look at it and think through it. And I was fortunate that they invited me back to speak again. And I answered the question from this perspective, and I want to share this with you. I looked at it from what if Black Americans have been able to fully participate in the innovation system that drove the economy. So I spent a lot of time, talking about post-emancipation kind of into the mid 20th century, right? This is effectively that kind of, Jim Crow type period. But this period is also the heart and one of the most important areas within the Industrial Revolution, right? You've got 2.5 million patents are created, right? That are driving today's economy, everything from telephone, light bulb, motion pictures, airplanes, transistors, so on and so forth. If you ask how many of those patents are attributed to Black people, it's around 726, right? Out of 2.5 million. It's almost a complete and utter shutout out of the innovation process. Why is this of particular importance? And it's because if you look at Professor Kortum from Yale, he says that a constant flow of new patents can generate a constant rate of economic growth. This is empirical. You can look and see this in the data. And if you look at the Brookings Institute, it says that the nation's unequal access to high quality schooling deprives the innovation system of people who might otherwise make or commercialize important discoveries, right? Really critical. Something else that I think is important that we all understand is that talent, skill, capability generally follows a normal distribution, a Gaussian curve. Fancy way of saying 70% of people tend to be in the middle, between average and good. 15% of the people tend to be substantially above average. I call that group the ultra brilliant. We all like to think we're part of that group. 15%, of course, are substantially below. What I've always thought was an interesting thing to think about is what was the size of that 15% ultra brilliant population within the Black community during this time frame, and what were they doing? So if you look at it from 1870, you've got about 730,000. Again, this is not the population of Black people. This is the ultra brilliant. By 1900, it's 1.3 million. By 1930, it's almost 1.8. By 1950, it's about 2.3 million, right? What are these people doing, right? When you start talking about 1870 and 1900 and the like, you're talking about various forms of sharecropping and tenant farming, right? As you get into 1935, you have almost 4 million Black people still working in the fields, right, in the South. Similar number to pre-emancipation, right? 1950, around that time, only about 1.6% of Black people even have college degrees, right? A massive underutilization of brilliance within the population. So what is the impact of that on wealth and income? Well, if those people had been fully incorporated, right, into the innovation system, we would have seen 280,000 more patents, not 726, right? We'd be looking at $2 trillion more in national income, right, associated with that. Now, independent work by McKinsey and Company says if you eliminated the wealth gap, it would generate $1.5 trillion per year every year on a going forward basis. And in terms of wealth, it would be over $9 trillion more incremental, right, wealth. So this is extraordinarily important. So what is the point here? There was a massive cost to Black people for this discriminatory behavior. There's no question about that, and it is gargantuan. If you look at the work from Economics of Discrimination, Professor Becker says that both parties engaged in discrimination pay a price, both the discriminator and the discriminated. Now, the price they pay is proportional to the capital difference between them. We've seen the enormity of the price that Black people pay, but there's also a massive price for the country, right? Which is the pie is actually bigger when you develop and deploy people. You don't engage in these discriminatory practices. Now, I want to kind of, end here, this portion of the talk with a couple of quotes, right? One from Albert Einstein, and he said, the worst disease under which the society of our nation suffers, in his opinion, is the treatment of the Negro. He was a huge advocate, right, for Black people. Many people do not know about that. And Emperor Selassie said in an address to the UN General Session or General Assembly that the basis for racial discrimination has been economic, and it is with economics that these evils can be overcome. I completely agree with that. We can transition to talking a little bit more about this kind of PhD economic framework, solutions, the importance of specificity and designing solutions, and of course that minority, diverse, inclusive doesn't mean Black. With that said, I'm going to stop sharing and switch it back. Thank you guys. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Shawn, I tell you, tremendous every time I have the opportunity to kind of hear from you, speak with you. Powerful in all regards. Just want to let the audience know, of course, the Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America is available on Amazon, Audible, or you can go to www.blacktaxed to be able to pick up the book. kind word to let our co-sponsors know is that we have some books on the way to you. So, that's something that, with everything that Shawn has gotten into, and there's a lot that he was not able to cover. All of that is within the book. So you have access to that. What's going to happen is with the audience, what we'd like to do is this. I know sometimes it's difficult to ask a concise question in chat. So giving people two options. One, if you have a question, you can drop it in chat, or if you'd like to ask a question directly, raise your hand, use the the icon to raise your hand, and we'd like to have you ask very concise, straightforward questions, no multiple questions in there. So therefore we can kind of get around to as many people as we can. Also like to let you know, I know that it advertises 4:15 as the end point. We were able to extend the period of time that we have with Mr. Rochester here till 5 if we need that. So therefore, there's opportunities for everyone to be able to ask a question that they would like to ask. So again, either use the chat, drop your question in, or go ahead and raise your hand so that we can kind of go ahead and identify you. And then if you could unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. So any, yes,
Andre,
sir.
I'm going to just, because I've been looking at the chat and we've got some questions here, so I'm going to help with that. And before I go to our first question from my colleague, Dr. Alana Hackshaw, I want to also thank you again, Mr. Rochester. This is tremendous, very important, very thorough, and I think you really have set the table for us and allowed us to have a really specific conversation about the debt that America owes to Black America. And so I want to make sure that we have ample time for as many questions as we can fit in the time that we have. And we'll go first to Professor Hackshaw, if you'd like to ask your question.
Please unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay.
I'll do. Okay. All right. So we're going to work on the our panelists can't unmute. So what we'll do, because of the nature of the webinar.
Oh, I can do it now. You gave me the option.
Okay, there we are. Okay.
Okay.
We've given you the ability to mute yourself. Okay. Thank you so much. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you, Shawn Rochester, for being here. I am so proud to see a fellow Yellow Jacket here, educating all of us on the debt that America owes to Black America. So thank you for being here. So glad to have you here. So my question for you is, I think you've done a fantastic job of really pointing out the historical work that needs to be done to sort of calculate the level of wealth that has been lost and stolen. But I also wanted to ask, because I did see that you did sort of start to look at the significance of homeownership, but I feel like in some of the research I've done and the readings that I've done about the New Deal, that the New Deal was a major vehicle for white Americans moving into the middle class. Getting access to not only home ownership, but also the discretionary type of income that allowed them to invest in the stock market, to invest in other homes, to invest in businesses. And so I'm just wondering, because a lot of your work does focus on the South, but I was wondering if you've also tried to calculate, in addition to home ownership, the type of wealth that was lost via the implementation of these New Deal policies. You know, for example, the ways in which, because African Americans were concentrated primarily in domestic and agricultural work and could not claim Social Security, or also how these might also be ways to sort of calculate this loss of wealth. That was the first question. I know that was a lot. So one is like, are you willing to also look at the ways in which the New Deal further complicates this? And then the second one is, do you believe that homeownership is still the answer to building wealth, since really white Americans have surpassed African Americans in terms of the types of vehicles that they're able to use now beyond homeownership to accumulate wealth?
So thank you, Professor Hackshaw. We're actually University of Rochester alum. And,
Woohoo!
and one of my amazing classmates there. So I love it. In terms of, so I'm going to kind of start with talk a little bit about the New Deal. So when you look at the Social Security portion of it, there's actually research that has gone into what is the opportunity cost associated with that. And the estimates are the exclusion of Black people from that in the first few years of it. It's about 143, I think it's about $143 billion in today's equivalent, right? Which is a large number in general, but a small number in terms of the fullness of the resources kind of denied to Black people. What a lot of people don't know is in order to get that legislation passed, right, in the South, and to get Southern Congress people engaged in that, you have to have some adjustments, put in place. The first, of course, was the exclusion of agricultural and domestic workers from Social Security. That, of course, knocked out about 70% of the Black labor force. The other requirement that was needed to get that passed was the local administration of it. So whenever you hear about local administration of things, that's the most effective way to explicitly discriminate, right? Those things had to be done to get that passed. So you knock out about 70% of folks just right off the bat, and then you can effectively take care of the remaining folks. Now, in terms of what is the full economic implication of the various kind of New Deal policies, which covers a range of things, right? It's through agricultural subsidies, it's kind of setting the length of the workday and the work week and being able to labor organize, and so on and so forth. That number I haven't explicitly calculated that number, right? It's a subset of what shows up in the difference of in terms of housing and other kind of forms of wealth accumulation. But these were gargantuan subsidies. I think New Deal stuff is on the order of, it's over $1 trillion, right? Kind of, investment into creating this property middle class that we know about. In terms of home ownership, right? Is that the way forward? The way forward to me is based on a foundation of what I call this kind of PhD framework, which is centered around addressing jobs, business, and capital explicitly. The outcome of any program, policy, or whatever has to be stimulative of job creation, business development, right? And capital availability and affordability in the Black community specifically. Now, home ownership is something that one can do when you actually have jobs that are family sustaining and allow you to accumulate resources on an intergenerational wealth. It has to be built, on a foundation, right, of jobs, business infrastructure and the capital infrastructure. The down payments are obviously significant, right? I think it can take a Black person like 30 plus years, 36 years to accumulate 20% down on a significant holding. So you need that. You need the jobs, business, and capital first. The second thing is when it comes to building wealth through home ownership. Well, first you have the cost of carry, which is the cost of actually maintaining a home, and that can be substantial. The second thing you have to look at is the appreciation, the equity appreciation on the house, right? And that's what's driving extraordinary levels of wealth increase for our white peers. Now, on a per income basis, you have about 18% difference in appreciation between homes in predominantly Black communities and white homes. So you can spend the same amount of money on a home, but at the end of 30 years, the Black person has 144,000 less in appreciation. So yes, home ownership is critically important because you're converting the money that you would spend to maintain your housing on some asset that you would eventually own, right, at the end of a 30-year period that you can pass on. That's clearly critical. But then there's other things that we have to look at. It has to be built on a strong infrastructure. And that infrastructure has to be driven by jobs, business, and availability and affordability of capital. So what we tend to do is spend a lot of time building a superstructure on top of the infrastructure that is not stable.
Absolutely makes sense. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So the big question that one of our has posed that I think we're all thinking about is how do we overcome the Black tax, right? So I'll just put that out there because I think we'll probably be touching on that
Yeah.
a number of ways. Within that, there are a number of more specific questions. And so keeping that question in mind, I want to ask if one of my former students or current students, Caitlin, wants to pose the question that she posted in the queue. Okay, I will read the question. She may not be able to read it. Do you think big companies and universities that obtain their wealth from slavery should aid in the funding of reparations through stock options specifically, especially since the North financed slavery, i.e. every descendant of American chattel slavery should have stock in companies that benefited or profited from slavery?
So let me start with a more fundamental thing, right? Is reparations necessary, right? And do I think it's necessary, right? So yeah, it's necessary. It's a $14 trillion gap. You own 2% of US wealth. The worst position you can be in a capitalist society is to not have capital, right? Freedom is an illusion if you don't have capital, right? In a capitalist society. You don't have capital, things are done to you, they're done for you or on your behalf. It's very difficult for you to do it, yourself, right? So will that need to happen at some point? I think the answer is yes, right? It's ingrained in almost all of our faiths, right? You have restitution for wrong that's being done. Slave owners have been compensated for their property loss, but based on a proprietarian kind of economic thought process, right? And other people clearly have received reparations. The how it should be best done, I think, is something that's open to debate, right? Is it done through, redistributive through taxation and a whole bunch of other things? I think those things are open to kind of debate. The position that I take is we just have to be very careful. Firstly, I think there should be reparations. People should get their resources and you should get it however, it's done. An area of caution that I have is it needs to be done. Even reparations needs to be done through a PhD economic framework, right? So it needs to flow in a way that stimulates job creation, business development, business formation, and capital availability and affordability. Again, we have a business infrastructure that's never been allowed to develop. It's underdeveloped. And it's part of the reason why only 2% of our spend is actually flowing to our own, businesses. So even if you divvied up and you gave every family or whoever qualifies $1 million, right, per family, start to think about how that will be deployed, right? That could be deployed in a mode or a manner where about 98+% of that is flowing out to other communities. It will be the biggest stimulus that the world has ever seen, right? The problem is the stimulus would happen outside because it wouldn't be flowing through our business infrastructure. So one of the most important things is that include the formation, the creation of an actual real business infrastructure, right, amongst and across the Black community, so you can actually start to have that circulative, regenerative, effect that we admire in other communities that we don't really have, in ours. So that's a note of caution, right, that I would have in terms of how it's distributed, right? You have a small portion of folks that would probably kind of recirculate from a capital perspective, but lots of people would probably wind up spending it. And then you would think about how the system is going to react, right? And I could kind of walk through some of those examples. So the best approach within it, I leave that to, other people to say. My caution is that you have to be careful with cash payments. We have limited business infrastructure to flow through. That has to be part of the deal, creating that kind of business, infrastructure. Then the other thing is we need a massive kind of, education of the general population, right? People clearly are against reparations. People take offense when you say a Black Lives Matters, right? Think about how kind of absurd that taking offense to that is. They don't really understand the history. They don't understand reparations for what, you know what I mean? Particularly when some people feel like Black folks have been free riding on affirmative action, right? Rocking and rolling for 60 years. You were enslaved, it wasn't that bad. You've been free for a long time. You have very little information and very little context, right? Very strong passion and a disproportionate amount of power. Like, we need to unpack a lot of that stuff. It has to be done through, obviously, media, conversations like this, a redevelopment and augmentation of the curriculum. So we're actually producing millions of people that have actual understanding of real kind of US history. And then it becomes logical that it's necessary. And the question becomes, how do you do it? Now, what we have to reinforce in this conversation is that it is stimulative. We already established, if you close the wealth gap, it's going to generate $1.5 trillion of economic activity. It's not a zero-sum game. I understand economic, that's how people think about it. I understand that that's been the case for over 500 years in the thought process. I understand where the pseudo-psychology, where that comes from, but the fact of the matter is that it actually increases the pie, and discrimination reduces the pie because it reduces commerce and reduces trade. That's economic facts, right? So long way to answer a question is less so on the specific mode of distribution, more so on avoiding what would be a challenge, right? We've got to have a business infrastructure that's kind of part of that deal. And it should follow this kind of, PhD economic framework. And we certainly need much more education. So you have more people who understand it and are on the problem solving side of the equation. And even, and people who, even if they're not part of the problem solving side of the equation, they're providing less resistance, when it comes to that. Long answer. I'm sorry about that.
No, that was great. I mean, in the confines of the time that we have, I think you hit it in a number of good places there. Moving on to the next one there, a good buddy of mine, he mentions that this has been a great conversation, wants to thank you. He's the CEO of a financial services firm, and he wants to know, how can we help business owners drive this message deeply into their organizations? We're always looking to close the wealth gap.
Yeah, so again, it's thank you very much for that question. I greatly appreciate it. Again, it's within the construct of this PhD, right, framework. So let's talk about it, right? So businesses, the purchase is in their supply chain, right? So it's to do more business with Black enterprise and identify what are the bottlenecks that prevent that from happening and be able to address those. Right? So first you need to have a standing demand to want to do more business with Black enterprise. The role where financial services can play a role is they need to make capital available, right? For these businesses. A lot of Black businesses are in effect micro businesses. They don't have the size, the balance sheet to supply into a Fortune 50 type company. So you're going to need capital to acquire into the supply chain, right? And by ownership now it's Black or minority owned, and they can slowly increase the representation of Black people on the payroll because they don't need anybody's permission to do that, and increase the representation of Black firms on the supply chain. But you got to have, I like acronyms. So I got an acronym called SWAG, right? You got to have working capital, you got to have acquisition capital, you got to have growth capital, you got to have them at scale, right? You got to have that available to meet the needs of businesses who kind of supply into that. And that's part of what financial institutions do. The other thing that's important for businesses and institutions of any kind is who's managing their pension assets. How are they leveraging their balance sheet, right? Because more of those assets needs to be the hands of Black asset managers who can make, Black enterprise a stronger part of their portfolios, either through acquiring to existing ones or buying those and making them Black or minority by definition now because of their controlling interest stakes associated with it. And how are businesses, putting their available cash flow into institutions that are providing liquidity into the Black community, whether it's a Black bank or credit union, CDFI, or another kind of, community bank that does a lot of business, right, within the Black community. So it's always really taking that framework, right? Are we properly represented on your payroll and supply chain? Right? Every institution and company can do that in the industry. How are you leveraging your balance sheet to provide liquidity within the Black community? And then also, to what extent are Black businesses participating, in your supply chain? And what are we doing to help facilitate that across the board? So I think those are some of the things that we first got to start with a paradigm shift, right? We all want a new set of actions, but new actions always follows new thinking. And the problem is we don't have that new thinking. We have a bunch of people that understand why these conversations are important. And if we're focused on the why, we never make any progress on the how, right? So the first part is to inform, which is what this is doing, and then transform, as opposed to spending all this time affirming kind of people's, belief system. JP Morgan Chase, they have a program called Advancing Black Pathways. I think that's really important because they focus on specificity, Black pathways, not minority pathways, not all this kind of other euphemisms for Black. That's critically, important. And they're putting money aside to, I think they're partnering up with Ariel Capital to set up an alternative fund so they can start buying kind of these larger companies between a couple $100 million and $1 billion, right? You need much more of that scale. That's a terrific kind of program. It needs to be about 100 times bigger than it is. So lots of other financial institutions can follow suit.
Excellent.
Hey, we have a question from Nefertiti Nassar. If she would like to pose a question, and I'm going to ask Ms. Nassar that you, because you have a number of really great questions that you posted, if you could try to pick your favorite question or your most burning question, or maybe consolidate your questions if possible.
And go ahead and unmute yourself, Ms. Nassar.
You're on mute. If you could, oh, maybe you can't. Give us 1 second. Allie, can you unmute Ms. Nassar?
You should be good to go.
She should be
All
good. Okay. All right. We will come back to you here. Oh, there you are. Okay.
There she is.
Sorry, I didn't have the privileges in Zoom. Okay, so I have actually several questions here in the chat box, but I'll ask you the first one that I have at the top. The first question that I posted was, in your opinion, what steps do you recommend Blacks take in 2021 towards economic advancement, both individually and as a unified community?
I think we're having some technical difficulties. Shawn, we're not hearing you, but you don't appear to be on mute. So give us 1 second here. We're going to try to figure out what's going on. I'm not sure why we lost your audio.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
It's the first question. I have several questions in the chat box, but it's the very first question that I prompt at the very top of the chat box. It's, in your opinion, what steps do you recommend Blacks take in 2021 towards economic advancement, both individually and as a unified community?
Yes, thank you so much. We have your question.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can now, Shawn. There we go.
You can hear me?
We're back.
Yes. Could you
Yes.
hear that?
I can't hear you guys.
Oh, okay. Let's see here.
Oh, wow.
I'm going to try to exit and see if I can re-enter and see if that works. So just
All
kind
right.
of bear with me here.
All right.
Sorry, everyone. We're having some technical difficulties here. I'm not sure why, but we got that question. Ms. Nassar, thank you very much. It's a great question. While we're waiting for Mr. Rochester to reconnect.
Oh, there he is. There he is.
Doing that now. Okay.
How do I sound?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Miracles of modern creation.
All right, Dr. Van Patterson, go ahead and, she said the first question, so go ahead and state that for him.
Yes. Well, Shawn, were you able to hear the question?
No, I didn't hear any of it.
So the first question that was posed, given the history detailed throughout your presentation, what do you recommend Black Americans be aware of as we strive toward economic advancement in 2021 and beyond?
So that's a good question. It's a very big question. So there are lots of different issues that people kind of put to their forefront. My focus is on jobs, business, and capital, right? So one of the things that I would focus on is our own ability, where possible, when possible, to do business, commercialize ourselves, our service providers, our businesses, so on and so forth. There's actually lots of room for us to do business with each other, and we don't. I'm not saying it's nefarious. Some of it's conscious, some of it's unconscious. We can buy our cars from Black dealers. We can work with Black attorneys and wealth managers, accountants. We can have, Black insurers for our homes and our cars. We can work with Black realtors if we're so blessed to be able to buy and sell homes and so on and so forth, right? We can increase or include our professionals in various types of transactions. The other thing we can do is to let the people with whom we do business with and the institution that we have relationships know that PhD is critical and it's important for us. I'll give you kind of some examples, right? Like I've seen some corporations that have decided that to show solidarity, right? And it's trying to do the right thing. One of the things they want to do is they want to make like Juneteenth a holiday, right? And I'm like, okay, you're going to pay to have your workforce stay home, right? For a holiday they don't know much about, right? I would say if that's all you're going to do, perhaps the money would be better spent. If you're a large corporation with a $15 billion payroll, that's $41 million a year that you're paying to have people stay home. How about you take that money and apply a PhD framework, right? And you invest that in recruiting Black talent, right? On onboarding Black talent and developing Black talent and advancing Black talent within the corporation. How about you take that money and you use that to get more suppliers engaged in your Black suppliers, engaged in your supplier diversity programs, and use that to provide working capital so as the contract size increases, they're able to continue to grow associated with that. How about you take that money and you put that money in a bank or a credit union or a CDFI that's actually going to lend it out into the community for business purposes, commercial purposes, and for houses and other kinds of things. That's a massive stimulative effect, right? So don't just do things that are symbolic and that has impact directed from this kind of PhD framework. What I would say is when you start talking to your representatives, make sure that they understand that the things that you're looking for are stimulative for job creation, business formation and development, and capital availability and affordability within the Black community, right? What are those policies? Take things a step further, right? We talk about low-income housing, which is really critical. It's important that people have the opportunity to own a home, right? I love it. But those are typically new starts. That means those homes have to be built, right? There's labor engaged in that. There is the supply chain of raw materials. Who's providing that expertise? Where are you procuring all of that from? How are Black service providers engaged in that? Where are the architects and the designers, right? Who are Black associated with that? You're clearly not going to give those homes away, right? So where are the Black realtors? Where are the Black insurers, right? Who's financing these transactions? There's a way to have these massive multiplier effects when you bring in this kind of PhD economic framework. And it's important that your representatives know that, right? That's what you're expecting. If you do that, you got them 100%, right? And they got to show you a plan for it. Give me the plan. I feel comfortable with it. You get your first term. You deliver the goods, you get your second term. If you don't, help me help you, right? It's not personal. It's just jobs, business, and capital. So that's something I will be thinking about, certainly this year and next year, and really every year beyond. There's a new administration in place. They want to make a difference, right? They want to invest. There's lots of rhetoric about what they're trying to do in disenfranchised communities and Black communities, under-resourced communities, low-income communities. Got to see jobs, business, and capital, right? And how you organize that in ways that have better health and educational outcomes in Black communities specifically, right? That's what I would say to focus on and make your voice be heard, loud and clear.
Excellent, excellent. We have a couple of anonymous questions. The first one is, what do you believe is the best thing, meaning the number one item that the Biden administration can do that can actually get done in this political climate? Is that reparations?
Can they get reparations done in this political climate? That's not even on the docket for them, right? So what needs to happen to push an administration, whether it's theirs or someone else? You need to have, a massive conversation. You need to normalize this conversation about reparations. It needs to be well understood that it needs to happen. We just shifted away probably a year or so ago from this thing being unmentionable, right? In areas of power at a corporate level, in political circles, so on and so forth. So perhaps I am ill-informed, and I apologize for that. I don't even see, or have not seen that is what this administration is driving for. I think we have to speak very loudly and very clearly that that's what you want. I think it's important that you need an augmentation of the kind of curricula so people are better educated on the history and the matter. I think there needs to be a double, triple, quadruple down on the economic benefits of it, because everybody thinks zero-sum game when it comes to Black people and Black interests and Black advancement, right? And they don't realize that the pie is bigger, and that needs to be on repeat, you know, on a perpetual basis. And what I'm looking for is specificity. So generally, when we hear lots of conversation about diverse, inclusive, and all this kind of other stuff, which are generally euphemisms for not white male. That's not specific when it comes to Black people. And language is really important. We need to understand that policy reflects language and the resources flow according to policy. So this dilutive language that people keep using on a perpetual basis is you really got to stop with that. You got to be hyper focused, right? So if you look at, you know, some of the actions, you read through these plans, right? There's a Black preamble, but then it's a diversity plan when you go under the sheets. And that's kind of across the board, right? It's really important that you see that. I'll give you an example. Like they talk about investing $70 billion in HBCUs and MSIs under the Black plan, right? The plan literally says the plan for Black America, right? And under that Black plan, that's $70 billion. We got to ask yourself, what's an MSI? It's a minority serving institution, has high levels of minorities there. How many of those are there? 700 of them. How many HBCUs are there? Roughly 101 of them. Take an average, that's about 14%. So if you can allocate those resources according to the amount of schools, are you telling me that 14% under the 70 billion that's in the Black plan is going to Black institutions, and 86% is going to non-Black institutions? Am I reading that right? Right. So you got to be really careful with this kind of language, right? How much resources are getting to Black enterprise, Black communities, Black people? I'll give you a really quick kind of concrete example of what I mean by this. If you look at supply chain spend, right? Businesses that are supplying into other businesses, that's what the economy is. It's an ecosystem of businesses, right? Consumers supplying into each other. If you say, I want to do more business with women entrepreneurs, I think that's great. Double, triple, quadruple down under it, right? And if you say, I want to do it with businesses of size, the ones who have employees, if you ask yourself, what's the amount of revenue that those businesses, women-owned businesses that have employees is driving? It's about 1.2 trillion, which is fantastic, right? If you ask how much of that's from Black women, because I want to know how much is going to Black women, right? Within that mix, it's like 2%. So for every $100 that you deploy into those initiatives, it's not until the 99th dollar that a Black woman is seeing a benefit, who's an entrepreneur from that. You got to be specific. If you say, let's invest in our Latino brothers and sisters, I'm all for it, man. Double, triple, quadruple down on it. If you ask the same question for those business owners that have employees, the larger ones, how much revenue they're driving, it's 380 billion, right, roughly. You say, how many of those are Black people within that construct? It's 2%. Again, it's not until the 99th dollar out of the 100th dollar. If you say, let's invest more in our Asian brothers and sisters, again, that's great. Invest in whoever you like and do it to the fullest extent that you can. Those businesses that have employees is $628 billion. There's no Black people in there by definition. If I add up that entire group in that category of diverse spend, only 4% of that goes to Black enterprise. The idea of filling a swimming pool to get a glass of water doesn't appeal to me, right? That is why you have to be specific in your language. If not, you're driving the economic benefits to all kinds of other groups. But it seems as if these resources are going to Black people. And if you're not getting the commensurate resources to grow and to develop and to advance, right? Then when people look around, they say 5 years later, what happened? Who they blame, right? Because they don't have the context. And we're not aligning their intention with the outcomes. That's why specificity is so vitally important.
Excellent. I don't think you can drill that home enough. You know, specificity of intent, purpose, and language. So definitely. Another anonymous question. What are your thoughts on a conglomerate approach of Blacks taking the lead to form banks and funds to support specific initiatives, similar to the Black Pathways program?
I'm all for economic cohesion, right? So the problem is we don't aggregate our capital, right? Capital is most powerful in its concentrated form. We operate as a group of individuals from a capital perspective. It's highly unproductive, right? And you don't get the leverage out of it. So if people aggregate their resources to be able to start a bank or buy a business, I think that's fantastic, right? That's what other groups do that we admire. There's lots of reasons why we don't do that. We have lots of biases ourselves. We have lots of trust issues. You know what I mean? There's been a tremendous amount of trauma, forced failure, right? When it comes to, business development, so on and so forth. But I'm all for doing that. And I don't think it should be just us. I think take the capital from wherever you get it, but the purpose, the outcome, the focus needs to be the same, right? You're creating jobs, business, and capital. You're doing so at scale within the Black community. Put your own capital in, leverage that, and then leverage other people's capital to that same end. The problem is, if capital is coming in, I call it flying under your flag, then it's great. If you don't clearly articulate what the purpose is, then you're flying under somebody else's flag. And that you should be very careful of.
All right, folks, that I think we've covered the questions that are in chat. If anyone has a burning question, raise your hand.
I will jump in myself but I'll wait to see if anyone raises their hand because I want to defer to our participants. Again, we thank you for making time for this vital conversation. This is the beginning of a conversation or certainly a continuation of a conversation. And so we look forward to more dialogue on this and more action on this, particularly with respect to the PhD framework that Mr. Rochester has articulated. Just as a quick commercial, reparations has come up, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Department of African American Studies, in collaboration with the Judge Alexander Williams Jr. Center for Education, Justice, and Ethics, is currently in the midst of a year-long series on reparations. We just had a webinar yesterday, and we have 2 additional webinars coming up in April, and then again in May, that are going to deal with the economic dimensions of reparations and also the policy solutions. We've had Barbara Lee, Sheila Jackson Lee, and a number of elected officials who have and will participate in that ongoing conversation. And we hope to continue to engage Mr. Rochester as well around that. So please, if you have additional questions and that you'd like to ask, feel free at this time. Since we are kind of winding down, you can go ahead and just unmute yourself or post a question in the chat, and we'll try to pick it up while we wait for you. I'll just throw out there one thing that comes to my mind, Shawn, as I listen to your insight, is this going back to this point you made about specificity.
Mm-hmm.
And I often tell my students that being pro-Black is not being anti-white or anti-anybody else. Unfortunately, though, there has historically been, even within the Black community, a reticence to really invest in sort of a Black ecosystem, if you will, in terms of economics. And I assume that a lot of that has to do with racism that you discussed and pointed to throughout your presentation. But I wonder too, if we haven't lost something in the positive efforts that have been made to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, because of the lack of specificity that often happens. And so the example for this, and I've written about this myself, is how the justification for affirmative action has now become diversity.
Yeah.
Redress for the long history and current, actual racial discrimination against Black people specifically, right? Mm-hmm. So many scholars have written on this. There's a book called When Affirmative Action Was White, which you essentially captured in your presentation earlier, looking at all of the redistribution of wealth to white Americans throughout this country's history. And yet, in the courts, we are now in this sort of era of, sort of the neoconservative colorblind racism informing policy. And then now with the Trump administration, just a reversion back to sort of explicit white supremacy, et cetera. And so I wonder how we can continue to advance the positive efforts of diversity, of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and I always add justice to that, at the same time that we bring this intention and specificity to bear on the questions, because at the end, as Lonnie Guinier and Jared Torres have argued in their book, The Miner's Canary, when you pay attention to race and you pay specific attention to the experiences of Black Americans within sort of the racial capitalist system that we have, what Joe Alexander calls the undercast, right? You figure out quickly what the problems are. You can address those problems in ways that actually do benefit the country as a whole, right? You've got to be specific, and so a sort of a long way of going to your point. But do you have any additional thoughts on how we can advance and promote diversity and inclusion without losing the specific historical and intentional aspect of what you're arguing?
I think in essence, it's what I'm trying to do is shift the paradigm, right? Being Black or Blackness is a horrifically designed construct that's really never been addressed. Black was designed, right, as the antithesis of white. Singularly, unquestionably inferior. I mean, none of this is hyperbole, but this is the fact. And then instituted and maintained through unimaginable levels of violence to get millions of people to really accept this. And it is a massive justification for the maldistribution of economic resources. That's why I always go economics. Like, people can get caught up in whatever they want, but racism is used to justify maldistribution of economic resources. That's why it's useful, right? And as you pass laws, people never deal with the underlying issues, right? So now you can address it specifically, intentionally, but you still have these belief systems. So you do need a massive shift in understanding, because I talk to thousands of people, all kinds of corporations and CXOs and whatnot. People always ask me, like, what do you say to white folks? I'm like, there's no other version. You know what I mean? Like, it's the same thing that I say to everyone else. I'm not giving you my opinion. I'm kind of giving you what the facts are on the matter. And it does affect some people in a profound way. I think the first thing to understand is that you're under no obligation to convince everybody of anything, right? There's a critical mass of folks who, if they understand, they can affect tremendous change. There's a disproportionate small group of people that control policy creation, execution, and the allocation of resources, right? And if they kind of get this and they start asking questions about how can we affect change, and you run it through a PhD framework, that can be very powerful. What other minorities, right, and our peers need to understand is, why do you need specificity? It's a legitimate question in the absence of information, right? There's this view that deprivation has been equitable. We're all the same, right? Deprivation was not equitable. It was unimaginable. It was targeted towards Black people. Inclusion is being driven through an equitable lens, right? And people need to understand the difference between the two, the why. Because when you start to have the conversation, mentioning Black is offensive to people. Whoa, why you gotta make this racial? The mentioning of Black, right? And it triggers a response, hey, what about me? So I didn't get finished telling you about our situation and you feel offended that you haven't been included. However, when we talk about your issues, there's no requirement to include what are you doing for Black folks? At any point, like, that needs to be understood. The levels of anti-Black bias, which I haven't spoken about at all, which the research is very clear on, is extremely high. The normal state, steady state, everyday situation is automatic white preference. And that shows up in literally every decision, right, that's being made. You can kind of trigger that, right? How is that showing up in ways that are beneficial? This is a two-sided equation, right? Somebody's being deprived and somebody is the beneficiary of it. So, like, these are just fundamental things that we need to talk about so that our friends understand it, right? Our allies, people that we interact with, get this framework. The best form of solidarity is economic solidarity. I think everybody needs to take a pause and say, yes, tremendous amounts of work have been done, but yet we're at 2%. Something here is not working. We're running the same play, right? Yet the average Black family has $200 liquidity. Yet we have the worst health. We have the worst health outcomes. We have the worst access to health. We have the worst treatment in health facilities, right? We have, the worst educational outcomes, the biggest gaps. You can go on and on and on. It's a disproportionate portion of what's negative. Why is that? If you don't understand the role that environment is playing and has played, you're going to attribute it to the individual. And if it's the individual's fault, why do I need to do anything about it? If you keep telling people things are so great, what do they need to fix? Right? Just kind of share the facts with them. And those who are interested in moving forward in a positive way should do so, right? And then we should ride with those people. I would say work with the people who want to work with you and resist the urge to hyper-focus on the intransigent, right? The opportunity cost is too high. Somebody, who wants to move forward is being kind of left out. So it's kind of a long answer, but it still goes back to the same impact, which is educate people on things. Like when I was having a conversation with Google, it's people were like, look, this is a 30-minute culture. So if people leave, don't be offended, right? I was there for 90 minutes, nobody left, right? Because they haven't been exposed to the information. People were asking questions like, where are these Black businesses? And how do I interface with them? And how do I do business? What is this Black bank thing, right? I never knew about Black banks. And how do we put our money in Black banks, right? Oh, by the way, how do we put Google's money in the Black banks? It's 3 years ago. What's Google doing now, right? So I think there's a huge opportunity to have more impact, to help companies direct their actions in economically productive ways. And that starts to address the gap. We got to have more cohesion amongst the group, right? As we rise, are we doing more business with Black enterprise? As Apple rises, they're taking 20,000 suppliers with them. You can buy stock in any of those folks that are supplying to those major companies, right? They're taking their supply chain with them. As we rise, are we taking are we doing more business with Black enterprise? If I'm doing 2% now, and I make $50 million a year, I'm still repeating the same thing. The group doesn't benefit, right? So there's some structural issues that are the matter, but it's all resolvable.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, folks, again, go ahead.
Professor Hackshaw.
Yes, just one more. I haven't heard Shawn's voice in so long. I just want to keep him talking.
We all do. We all do.
So, Shawn, I wanted to ask if for the African Americans of high net worth that you've been able to reach and get your message to, I wanted to ask what you have found in terms of their responsiveness to this message, and when you have found moments of responsiveness, where are you seeing people want to place their energies in supporting this?
Yeah, so I hear different things, right? Some people are like, thank you for articulating what I've been trying to say for so long, right? Other people are like, I really do need to think more deeply about kind of upgrading who I'm doing business with, right? There's lots of folks that they didn't mean to not be doing business with us, right? So they're like, okay, who's my wealth manager? Who's my this, that, and the other? There are people who've had bad experiences with Black enterprise, right? And they say, well, what about X, Y, and Z? And then we have to have another kind of conversation about that, which is we are also biased against ourselves, right? We're biased against our business owners, and our business owners are biased against Black consumers. And we interpret these actions differently, right? And how do we start to break that? And part of what's necessary is we actually need systems and platforms in place that allow this to happen in less frictionless and a mode of less friction, right? That's associated with it. So people will say, well, I try to do business with this person and that person. I don't like what was happening. Okay, well, that's 1 out of 2.56 million, right? That's not everyone. So do we do a good job of highlighting business owners or service providers that have done a really, really great job, right? So that when somebody else says, I want to branch out and do business with whom, you pass them to a terrific, service provider. They don't have to go through a couple, of folks who are not ready for prime time to make things more efficiently. It is really important that kind of the top 10, 5% of wealthy Black people direct their resources to Black enterprise and institutions, right? The vast majority, 56% of all Black wealth is in the hands of the top 5% of wealthy, Black people. It's them moving their capital into a Black financial institution that matters, right? It's the $1,500 account that somebody who's trying their level best to do, right? It's not going to move the needle. There are people who have 60,000, right? $300,000 of liquid rainy day money, right? The best kind of stable deposits that you can imagine, are they putting that into Black financial institutions? Are we aggregating our resources to think about that? And are we coupling those deposits with tier 1, tier 2 capital, fancy way of saying making equity investments in these institutions so that they can scale up, right? They need to augment the staff, they need to augment the systems and processes, the back office, all that kind of stuff. They're going to get that through capital infusions from tier 1, tier 2 investors. Both of those things have to happen at the same time. And how is that really being, organized? And it's not being organized well. And those wealthier people are accustomed to a different level of service that has to be met. The idea of, as I'm going to come in levels below that, is not going to work, right? It's a multi-pronged attack that you could do at the same time. So, and we don't have good systems to be able to coordinate all of those folks. And that's just the deposits, right? We even get into the retirement, assets and whatnot that's associated with them. So we could do, much more. And by the way, that class of folks are the primary beneficiaries from all the protests that happen. We're getting all the promotions. It's that class of people. Were they out in the streets with these young people? No, for the most part. So I think you have an additional responsibility to make sure that we're advancing everybody. We're not just benefiting from all of this, right? This board appointment, that CXO appointment, this advancement, that advancement. I mean, those are for people who weren't driving this, right? Kind of in the street, they didn't pay that price. And we got to make sure that those folks are not left out.
Excellent.
Thank
Excellent.
you.
As we're kind of winding down, folks, a couple of people have asked as far as access to the webinar. So we're going to make sure the webinar is accessible at the Judge Williams Center's website, the Brewer Cultural Center's website, and then some other platforms will make sure that this information gets out there. So stay tuned for that. You could either reach obviously Mr. Rochester directly, if you for any follow-up. He's unpacked so much information in regards to you ordering the books or inviting him to come speak or present, what have you. So that's available. You can reach myself, Andre Nottingham, at an@umd.edu for any follow-up questions, and Dr. Cameron Van Patterson at cameron@umd.edu if you had any follow-up in that regard. But we want to make sure if there's any burning last question out there, we want to be able to allow someone an opportunity to ask that burning question. Secondly, want to thank Mr. Rochester. I mean, this has been powerful. I mean, just the bullet points that you hit as far as the slavery at the 50 trillion, Jim Crow 15 trillion, education 3 trillion, the housing 4.2 trillion, labor 4.4 trillion, the New Deal, GI Bill, interstate highway, the 1965 to the present 3.3 trillion, the 14 trillion, 1.4 million businesses, 6 million jobs that are missing from the Black community. I mean, those are just powerful, and you can kind of spend time covering any one of those in detail extensively. So the book, folks, get the book, check it out if you want to get more detail with that. So definitely want to encourage you, Amazon, Audible, or www.blacktax.
And again, to echo my my brother and colleague, Andre Nottingham. First of all, I want to thank Andre, Dr. Ron Ziegler, the Nine Brewer Cultural Center, for working so diligently to bring this to us, to create this forum. Couldn't have done it without their support. The Nine Brewer Cultural Center is a entity that we need to continue to support. And so we will definitely be looking to apply PhD and to operationalize PhD in ways that can address the systemic structural anti-Black racism that that we all have to be serious and intentional about addressing. Want to thank again, Shawn Rochester. One of the things and I'm going to quote you, Shawn, I believe you said, the best form of solidarity is economic solidarity.
That's right.
And as soon as you said that, my mind went straight back to Kwanzaa, cooperative economics. So there it is. I'll have to apply that logic because you've already, it's there. And in so many ways, I think this information is out there, but we haven't been about the business of application to the extent that we obviously need to. I just want to thank you. I want to thank Professor Hackshaw and all of our students who were able to join us this afternoon. If you registered for this webinar, you will receive an email once we have the recording ready, and we'll send that out to you that way as well. So you should get it in your inbox. Again, I want to echo Andre in thanking our co-sponsors, all of whom will receive some copies of the book, The Black Tax. And so we hope this is something that's been educational and informative for everyone. Shawn, give them your information one more time. How can they learn more about PhD and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm available on LinkedIn. I got to work on my social media game, so you guys can bear with me. As obviously Shawn Rochester. On Facebook is Shawn Rochester. Instagram as Black Tax. Twitter as Black Tax. Yeah, the books are available on the website www.blacktax.com or on Amazon and Audible for you to get. The information is powerful. It's unique. It's a perspective that others don't take. It is very consistent with the language of business and the deployment of capital and resources. It is not written in an emotional way, but it emotes in a profound way. And it resonates with people. It causes people to pause, think through what they're doing. It causes people who run churches to think about how they're applying PhD. It causes, corporations to think about, how do I approach things in a more specific way? How do I leverage my balance sheet? How do I make sure that we're doing more to develop and deploy, our employees? How to be specific. That is so critically important because so much of these actions are very dilutive to Black interests, and how to stay focused on economics.
The last word I just told Mr. Rochester and Dr. Van Patterson and I, we had said that this is not just a one-Osman kind of thing, is that we will remain engaged with Mr. Rochester, one in our campus community here at the University of Maryland and also in our local surrounding community here in Prince George's County. So, we will definitely, follow up with some additional items to come from here. So that's something definitely wanted to share. In addition, the Nibiru Cultural Center celebrates its 50th anniversary, October 2021. So stay tuned, folks, for some further information coming out in that regard and help us celebrate our 50th anniversary here. So definitely. Any last departing words from my colleague, Dr. Van Patterson or Mr. Rochester? This has been powerful. Like I said, we've talked extensively, but each time we do have this venue or the opportunity to hear you, it's definitely, it leaves an impression. So I appreciate you.
Thank you guys for having me. Thank everyone for staying on and devoting your afternoon to this really important conversation. Propagate it out. It has a transformative impact. And we're looking for bigger and better platforms, bigger platforms to have more people aware of this and more people working on the how we do this versus why are we talking about this.
And again, thank you very much to our guests who have joined us for this webinar. Thank you very much for your time and your attention to this topic. And we look forward to continuing to work. So want to close it out with just thanking everybody. And we appreciate your time and look forward to connecting with us again. Thanks again, Mr. Rochester, Dr. Van Patterson.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. Take care.